Just ahead on American Black Journal, we're going to have a really intense conversation with Detroit Police Chief James Craig. We're going to talk about the Black Lives Matter protests and the opportunity for change and reform here in the city of Detroit. Stay right there. American Black Journal is next.
From Delta Faucets to Behr Paint, Masco Corporation is proud to deliver products that enhance the way consumers all over the world experience and enjoy their living spaces. Masco, serving Michigan communities since 1929.
Support also provided by the Cynthia and Etzel Ford Fund for Journalism at Detroit Public TV.
The DTE Foundation proudly supports 50 years of American Black Journal in covering African American history, culture, and politics. The DTE Foundation and American Black Journal partners in presenting African American perspectives about our communities and in our world.
Also brought to you by Nissan Foundation and viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to American Black Journal. I'm Stephen Henderson. It has been quite a year for the Detroit Police Department. Police Chief James Craig and several other officers were infected with COVID-19 and had to be quarantined during the pandemic. And the Black Lives Matter protests have put the department to the test over several weeks. I spoke with the chief about the things that are going on and the opportunity for change and reform in the future. Let's start with this. We are seeing these massive protests in the streets, not just in Detroit, but in cities all over the country. And I guess my question for you is, how did we get to this place where police and the communities that they are supposed to be keeping safe have so many tensions between them, and where that relationship seems to have broken down in so many places and in so many ways?
Well, you know, Steve, I think the best thing we have to start with what's going on in Detroit, what's going on in the national landscape. You know, as many of your viewers know, that Detroit was the exception when you compare the images we saw of rioting, full-blown riots in other big cities. We're talking about looting, buildings being burned, police officers being attacked. And what we didn't see in Detroit, and while the first few nights, certainly there was violence, but there was no looting, no large-scale riot. And so the question is, why not Detroit? And so when you talk about the relationship between the Detroit Police Department and our community, I believe it's well above average. We didn't wait for the tragic death of Mr. Floyd to start trying to build trust-based relationships with our community. We didn't start then. This has been a framework and institutionalized in our department since I've gotten here, because you can't wait and respond. So that's number one. If we're going to talk about some of the other cities, clearly the relationships were already fractured. When you think about Minneapolis, the death of Mr. Floyd, there were issues that existed before Mr. Floyd. So it's no surprise. And so then when you go and take a deeper dive into what really took place, what we do know is that there's just some folks that who came into Detroit from the outside. You've heard me report on it. I'm talking about out of the state, certainly outside the city. They have no relationship with this department. And many of them felt they were speaking for Detroiters. And as you saw, they weren't speaking for Detroiters. In fact, it outraged many local activists. Says, we don't agree with this. We want you to go home. And then embedded with these outsiders, some were criminals, agitators, if you will, who really tried to stoke the flames and really incite riotous behavior. And it didn't work here in Detroit because we had many community members on the ground who joined the marching for the sole purpose of maintaining peace. And I don't think you saw that that strategy in many other places.
Yeah. So let's talk about, though, that relationship between Detroit police and citizens here. And as you point out, there's been a lot of change since you've been here. Some of that change we were trying to affect before. I mean, we were under a consent decree with the federal government for a very long time, specifically to deal with brutality and rights violations that were taking place. At the same time, we still have a lot of progress to make here in terms of again, that relationship. We're building it; it's getting better, but in absolute terms, we still have our issues. I wonder what you make of the suggestions that we have to rethink this on an even bigger scale than we have before. In other words, that quote unquote reforming the police department is not enough, and that you've got to defund or dismantle. Those are maybe not the best descriptive words for what people are talking about, but maybe rethink is the word that best describes that. As the chief of this department, are you open to the idea that we can rethink policing on a fundamental level?
On a fundamental, yes, Stephen. First, I'm going to vigorously push back when you or anyone else suggests that we have tremendous work to do, or at least you alluded to that. I'm going to push back because we don't see the fractured relationships that you see in other cities. And as you pointed out, we were under consent judgment, federal oversight for 13 years. Mm-hmm. We got out from under that within a year of my appointment. So the department has made tremendous progress and continues to make progress. We have a very different police department. Now, are we perfect? Absolutely not.
Sure.
We're not. There is no perfect anything, and certainly there's no perfect police department. But when you draw a comparison, it becomes abundantly clear that Detroit's very different. And the national landscape, your colleagues on the national level want to know what makes Detroit so different. So we need to start and stop painting the profession with a broad brush. And let's talk about the elephant in the room, because certainly there's a lot of emotion today. I understand it. Mm-hmm. Certainly this chief and many in this department, we don't embrace what happened to Mr. Floyd. We took a very firm stand. In fact, I was probably the first police chief in America that came out and indicated that Mr. Floyd should have been arrested. Not Mr. Floyd, but the officer who murdered Mr. Floyd should have been arrested. That's what police departments do. It's called probable cause. And so when we make those sweeping statements, I have to push back. Now, does it mean that there's no room for improvement? Absolutely. Right. And there are things that we're working on right now to move the needle to the next level. When you talk about this whole idea of defunding, I mean, conceptually, it's probably a bad word or a bad way to describe, but when you talk about, well, we don't think a police department should be directly involved in the servicing of individuals suffering from mental illness. I agree with that. Mm-hmm. I think that, social workers, we've been crying out for years now about the broken system, and there needs to be improvement. But however, Stephen, we mustn't forget that if we're dealing with a mentally ill person and that person exhibits violence, that is a police concern. One of the things that we've seen an uptick in, particularly since COVID, a dramatic increase in the number of critical incidents that we have had to respond to with our special response team. I'm talking about barricaded suspects, armed suspects who are directly a threat to our community. We've had to respond to manage those things, and the numbers have increased. I think we've, over that period, I think from May 25th to current, 11 such incidents. And of that number, 70% we know are individuals suffering from mental illness. So it's a big challenge. So there's a lot of dynamics in play. And I just would ask that we take a step back in a non-emotional way, and I'll give this to you because this always comes up. If we get involved in a shooting incident, officer-involved shooting, the first question that your colleagues were asked, was the officer white? And was the person shot black?
Mm-hmm.
So there's this belief that if it was a white officer and the suspect was black, it didn't matter that the suspect, and this is a true incident that happened, I want to say late last year, where the officers made a traffic stop. And as they made that stop, a suspect immediately got out of the car and opened fire on the officers. Does it really matter in that scenario if the officer was white, which he was, and the suspect was African-American? Factually, the suspect opened fire on the officers, and the officer, feeling a direct threat to his life, his partners responded.
Yeah.
And so that's the kind of conversation we need to really have without jumping to conclusions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the same time, the racial dynamics in this country are the sort of table setting for any conversation about policing, about the relationships between police and communities. And so it makes sense that that is one of the things that people focus on and ask questions about. I mean, I think jumping to conclusions about it is problematic, but that focus seems really relevant given the things that have gone on. But I also wonder if you can talk about the ways in which we do see the need for change here in Detroit. I mean, if you were to be able to change policing in Detroit with the snap of a finger or the flip of a switch, what would you say we ought to be doing differently beyond the mental health question, which I think is a really relevant issue? A lot of people are saying we need to really rethink that whole relationship. And if you think about this incident during the protests with the officer who was in the truck that was surrounded by the protesters, his reaction, hitting the gas, which was an escalation.
Steve, I gotta push back on you because obviously you don't know all the facts, and that's my point.
Well, I saw the video.
I know what it looks like. Trust me. And I'm going to take a very strong position because I do know more about what transpired. Mm-hmm. You were not there. I had the benefit of exhaustively looking at the issues. And I know what it appears. And as I've said publicly many times, and oh, by the way, just so you know, many Detroiters, so many Detroiters support the position that I took. They saw that this was not, the individuals that surrounded that police vehicle were not peaceful protesters. Did it start out as a peaceful protest? Absolutely. The vast majority, I think there were a total of about 350 protesters. Mm-hmm. And the car was surrounded roughly 20 to 30. That group, the instigators, the angry, it went from agitation to being extremely angry to violence. And so I don't know how much you know about the video, but imagine yourself seated in a car with an angry mob surrounding it. They're beating on the sides of the car. They're shouting obscenities. In fact, at some points, jumping on the hood of the car. Mm-hmm. And then if you really study the video, you would see where the officer was at least initially, trying to dislodge the protesters that had surrounded. This officer knew definitively what has happened, not just here in Detroit, what happens when a police officer gets surrounded by an angry mob. And so as this continued to progress, what you saw is what the officers heard was the rear window being smashed out. The officers didn't smash the window out. The window was smashed out. And so that's not peaceful. But more important than that, we have to explore and examine what was in the officer's mind at the time the rear window. And what I found out, and I wasn't in that car at the time, the officer wasn't sure if he was being shot at.
Okay.
And police officer had been shot. But let me finish my point.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So the officer feeling that he and his partner, there was an imminent threat to their safety, they made a decision to get out of there. And again, in the initial movement of the vehicle, you could see where the officer was trying to dislodge the protesters, but then certainly they accelerated what we believe at the time of the smashed window. And then when you talk about the acceleration, maybe 20, 25 miles an hour, what we estimate. So let's
so I guess
know the facts.
Yeah. So I guess my question is, and I think that's an absolutely accurate description of what happened. The question, though, is if you're a police officer in that situation, isn't your duty, isn't the call to you to de-escalate the situation? And then the second question is, does hitting the gas and endangering the people who, let's stipulate to everything you said about.
Are you going to dismiss the fact that what I just explained to you at some point? Oh, and one thing I did leave out is the fact that some of the angry protesters or mob were making efforts to get inside the police car.
Let's stipulate.
And so what I'm saying is that de-escalation, at that point, the officer had one concern: I need to get out of here.
Okay. So I mean, and you and I could argue about whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing for a long time, and maybe never come to an agreement. But I guess the question that I think people are asking now is there a different way? Is there a better way to configure the police department so A, that kind of situation doesn't happen, and B, that the response isn't that escalation that could have resulted in great bodily harm or death to the citizens who were doing that? And let's say for the sake of argument, they were misbehaving. Let's say they were breaking the law.
What do you mean for the sake of argument? Did you take a look at the video, Stephen?
I've seen the video.
Did you really see? Did they look like peace-loving marchers that had no ill will toward the officers? I mean, what I'm suggesting to you, see, a full press conference and showed multiple views. Mm-hmm. I also indicated in my remarks that several of the protesters were armed with hammers. That was dismissed by some, and now we have an image that shows a protester in possession with a hammer. So do you think, Steve, that maybe he was going out to do board ups as a way to beautify the city? And I know I'm being a little bit sarcastic right now, but what I'm asking you to do is take a step back yourself, try to understand, and I'm not dismissive of it. Anytime force is used, we do a very thorough evaluation. We determine, could things have been done differently? But I will tell you, when you have an angry mob, and we're not talking about the peaceful protesters surrounding the car. We've seen the images not only here in Detroit, but in other cities where police vehicles were overturned, they were set on fire. I mean, so I'm confused with your failure to really see it from that. But the average Detroiter, the folks that have reached out to me and says, you know, I don't understand why you're getting backlash. What were those officers to do? So
I don't think it's backlash. Again, I think there are legitimate questions that people are asking about the way in which policing is configured and seems to invite this kind of tension and clash. Is there a different way?
Let me tell you what invited the tension. So the vast majority of the protests have all been peaceful. Mm-hmm. On this one evening, there was a core group early during the march that was clearly agitated. And here's where it reached a point to where that core group of 20 or 30 got extremely angry and decided to surround not one police vehicle, but two. Mm-hmm. And so what set it off, if you will, was the fact that the police officers had blocked a street that they wanted to go down. Now, the officers thought they were doing and trying to be helpful by blocking the street and directing them in another direction. They didn't want to go in another direction. Yeah. Now, if anything could have been done different, and which has been our practice, we have given the protesters the opportunity to go where they wanted to go. But for whatever reason, the leadership that they felt that going down another less traveled street would be safer
Right.
for those marching. So that was the decision. And because of that decision, this group of 20 to 30 were enraged, became angry, and became violent. That's the bottom line.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I mean, I think the questions that are being asked are about what the response should be when that happens. And I guess what I'm trying to do is kind of focus on what are the ways that we can rethink the department? What are the ways that we can rethink training? That puts us in a different space.
We always, as I indicated, we evaluate every incident, critical incident that we're involved in. And we're always open to do self-assessments and be critical. Unfortunately, the cars got surrounded. Shouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
The officers did not anticipate that happening.
Sure.
Now, we learned early on from day 1 and 2 where, candidly, the cars got surrounded. And so we learned not to put ourselves in that position. But again, we're dealing with a core element. We're not talking about law-abiding or peaceful protesters, which we support. And our only reason for being there is to keep them safe as well as to keep our community safe. So when you talk about rethink, and so one of your colleagues asked me this question from a local paper and said, well, why don't you just sit there and stay in the car? So let me see if I process it. So we sit there, don't move the car, glass is being broken out, maybe the car is starting to get pushed to tip it over.
Right.
There's an effort to get inside of the police car. Do we really think that's the appropriate response given the anger that was displayed?
Yeah.
I say to you,
I don't know. I don't pretend to know the answer to that. I think what people are suggesting is that law enforcement should know the answer to that, and law enforcement.
That's why I'm articulating to you on why it happened and what we do in response to every critical incident. Sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we don't. When we don't get it right, we debrief, we make adjustments in our training. I'm saying in this incident that those officers had no way of knowing that their car was going to be surrounded.
Sure.
They just didn't.
Yeah.
And again, they were trying to do a good thing by blocking the street, at least in their mind, and the ones who were agitated didn't want to accept it. Yeah. That's what drove the anger.
So I want to change subjects just a little in the few minutes that we have left with the interview, and talk about the future here in Detroit and what you see. Ultimately, protests never last forever, and this will move from that phase to a phase where we are talking about reform and talking about things that might change over time. I wonder what you are anticipating in that regard, and what opportunity maybe you see from the standpoint as the department's chief for changes that would really matter.
Well, for starters, as I indicated earlier in this segment, we're always open to look for better ways of how we provide service to our community. We recognize we're not perfect. One of the things that we're going to move very quickly on working on is some work we started about a year and a half, 2 years ago, called procedural justice. Because we recognize that we have officers that have had encounters and the service delivery was not what it should have been. We have community members that have expressed concern about their encounters, but what about the way they handled the encounter? So we're looking at something that we're very excited about. But again, a lot of the issues that are being placed on the table, Stephen, that comes up like, we want chokeholds abolished. Well, guess what, Stephen? We've abolished chokeholds years ago.
In this department, right, yeah.
Well, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
You're talking about what are we going to do here in Detroit?
Right.
We operate from a place of using best policing practices that came out of federal oversight. So a lot of what's being asked we already do. I mean, when you talk about our neighborhood police officer initiative that's been launched for now 5 years, the community raves on that relationship. And so there's a lot of things that we're doing that, frankly, that people want in other police departments. I'm not saying, and so we are one of the models, and in a large part because we were under federal oversight for so long. And so we adopted many of these practices.
Thank you very much for being here. And it's great to see you up and around and healthy like everyone else. I know you had a bit with COVID, like a lot of others.
Did. Yeah. Very fortunate and blessed.
That's going to do it for us. You can go to AmericanBlackJournal.org to view past episodes. And as always, you can connect with us on Facebook and on Twitter. We'll see you next time.
From Delta Faucets to Behr Paint, Masco Corporation is proud to deliver products that enhance the way consumers all over the world experience and enjoy their living spaces. Masco, serving Michigan communities since 1929.
Support also provided by the Cynthia and Etzel Ford Fund for Journalism at Detroit Public TV.
The DTE Foundation proudly supports 50 years of American Black Journal in covering African American history, culture, and politics. The DTE Foundation and American Black Journal partners in presenting African American perspectives about our communities and in our world.
Also brought to you by Nissan Foundation and viewers like you. Thank you.